This video tutorial is about AM and PM and the kanji that you need to write those two things. First of all, AM and PM mean before noon and after noon. So we need to know the kanji for noon to write these two words. And here it is. Let's have a look at the stroke order now. We start our character for noon, which is pronounced go, with a little downward stroke, a little bit. And that reminds me of the stroke of noon, the bells which chime at noon. So we add one. Then we do what looks very much like the kanji for two. So we go across, and finally we go down. Now you remember that across and down means 10. If we add 2 to 10, we get 12, and that's the stroke, not of midnight, but midday, exactly midday. Now that used to be a picture of a pestle. That's that little gadget that you rub inside a kind of a hard bowl to grind things with. And the reason that they used this symbol was because it struck the middle of the mortar bowl. But it doesn't much look like a pestle these days. So I think we can just think of it as striking midday. 2 plus 10 is 12 o'clock. Now for AM, we need the kanji for before, because we're going to put midday, 12 o'clock first, and then we're going to put before next to that, and that will mean midday before, in other words, AM. Let's have a look at the kanji, which means before or in front of. Now this kanji before has two elements which we can recognize. This one here can mean month, but it can also mean flesh, and it can be a squished up version of this kanji, which means meat or flesh. This is how we draw it. It goes 1 down here, 2, 3, and 4. And it's sort of a cross section of a piece of meat. It's like a piece of steak. Now, when you contract that and squish it up and make it an element of a kanji, it looks just like this. Equally, the kanji that we've already met for moon, that also, when it becomes an element, looks like this. Now, in fact, historically, this element here is neither meat or moon. It's something different, but it's not very useful to remember this kanji by. So I think it's much more useful thinking of this element as either moon or meat, and I, in fact, prefer meat. On this side, this element here, this is identifiable as a knife or a sword. So we've got flesh on the left, we've got sword on the right, and these two things here, they look very much like animal horns. So from now on, we're going to think of them as the animal horn element. And this is how we would put it all together. On top, we would put our two horns, 1, 2, and then that line underneath goes with them. So we've got our animal horns on top. On the left-hand side, we've got our meat or flesh. Close them off in the middle. And on the right-hand side, we've got what looks very much like hiragana ri, but it means a sword. Now this means before. Now we have to put the story together. So we've got the animal horns there on top, we've got the flesh over here on the left, and we've got a sword over here on the right. Remember, the meaning is before, so I suppose it stands to reason that before we have our steak here, we've got to grab the bull by the horns, and we've got to use our sword to cut it up. My apologies to vegetarians, but I hope that helps you remember Maya before. Now, if we take the first kanji we've looked at, this one here, which means midday, and then we add this kanji, which means before, we get midday before, pronounced gozen, which means, of course, AM, before midday. Now we're going to go down and have a look how to write PM. And for this, we're going to need the character, which means after. Just before we go to the elements and the stroke order, let's have a look at the early origins of this character. It's quite interesting. Now you've probably recognized that left-hand element there as being exactly the same element as we have in the character meaning to go. And in fact, that's standing in here for the meaning of to go. So we've got going on the left-hand side, And then on the right hand top side here, you can see it quite clearly, but in each case it's really quite easy to identify. And these are cocoons, they're silkworm cocoons, and they're used a lot in characters because the ancient Chinese economy was largely supported by the production of silk. And of course, to produce silk you need these cocoons here, and you take the silk thread from them. So we've got on the left hand side to go, we've got silk cocoons on the right hand side, and underneath this element is to do with feet, and I call it walking legs. So let's have a look what those elements look like these days. Okay, here's that left hand element. We're going to of course write from top to bottom, and that means to go. Then you've got this one on the right. Now that is a modification or a modernization of what you saw a moment ago, which was the two silk cocoons like that. So that there are the silk cocoons, and then underneath you've got this element which I call walking legs. So we've got going along, we've got the small tiny silkworms, and then you've got walking legs. And it's proposed, scholars think, that the meaning of behind or after is derived from the fact that if you take tiny little silkworm-like steps and you go along, then that will delay you and you will end up being behind others. You will go after others. So that's where the meaning of behind or after comes from. Let's see what happens when you put it together with the character for midday. Okay, here's the character for midday. It's pronounced go. And then we have the character for behind or after, and that's also pronounced go. And we get gogo, and that's PM, gogo.